As a kid, I was taught that name-calling was bad. I thought I was doing a pretty good job until I met Father Joe. In the gospel, it seems like Jesus is calling Peter a name, a very intense name. Jesus calls him Satan. So what's going on? The context here is that Peter, in last week's gospel we heard when Deacon was preaching, Peter just proclaimed that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He had this revelation from God, and then Jesus gave to him the authority of the church, the authority over the church. And right after that is today's gospel, where Jesus begins to talk about how the Son of Man is going to suffer greatly, and he's going to be killed, and on the third day rise again. And it's precisely then that Peter responds with what we hear today. God forbid, Lord. No such thing shall ever happen to you. Peter could not accept what Jesus was saying, so he responds very strongly, and it's precisely then that Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." He says that you are an obstacle to me. You're not thinking as God does, but as human beings do. The fact is that Peter probably means well. Peter is saying, wait a second, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ, I'm not going to allow that to happen to you. But Peter didn't realize that his thinking was very similar to the thinking of Satan. That his thinking represented an obstacle to Jesus giving his life for us on the cross. It was the very temptation that Jesus experienced to pull back and not to give everything on the cross. And so Jesus says, your thinking ultimately is demonic. Your thinking is resisting me from giving everything on the cross. You see, it wasn't until Peter understood how God sees things, it wasn't until Peter had his mind renewed about God's plan that he realized that thinking was bad. And so it is with us. Unless our minds are renewed by the truth of God, unless our minds are able to see how God sees, we are also going to often fall into thinking that resists God and becomes an obstacle to God. Our thinking actually can become demonic in nature. And this is something that we can often see today. And so today I want to just simply share two ways in which our thinking can become demonic. Our thinking can resist God and become an obstacle to God. Way number one, our thinking becomes demonic when we don't take what God says seriously. When's the last time you heard someone who had an issue with church teaching, an issue with the gospel, issue with something in Christianity, and as a response, they hit their knees and began to pray and say, God, please give me some revelation, please give me your wisdom. Then they began to study Scripture. They began to look at church teaching, look at what the church has taught, and maybe reading some other books and studying as to why the church teaches what it does. And at the end of all of that, say, you know what, I was wrong, and I believe the church is right, and I believe Jesus is right, and change their mind. When's the last time that you know of that happening? It doesn't happen very often. And one of the reasons why is that we often resist what God says. We often have a little mini rebellion against what God says, especially when it disagrees with what we think is right. If you remember my July 4th letter to the parish, I said I wasn't surprised that some people put politics before faith. After all, we live in a culture that is inundating us with its own way of looking at things. And we often spend more time being influenced, informed by culture through our news and through our popular culture than we do being formed by the Scriptures or by the church's teaching. And then I'm not surprised that people put politics before faith. And some people mean well. Such people can mean well, but sometimes as a result, their mind's not being renewed by how God sees things. They end up resisting God. And some people aren't so innocent. Some people don't want to hear what God has to say because they're afraid that God is going to challenge them to change their position. So they avoid understanding what God is saying. They don't want to know what God is saying. But notice that both of them end up in the same position. Their mind's not renewed, and both of them resisting God, and their thinking becomes an obstacle to God. Whether or not they realize that their thinking becomes demonic. And when that happens, what begins to happen is that our view of justice, our view of love, our view of mercy in our society begins to get darkened. because our mind is not renewed and we're not thinking like God. The second way is our thinking can become demonic when we no longer search for the truth in a matter, but instead seek to control others so that we can get what we want. When we seek to control others, we seek to manipulate them, not only do we lose our ability to think critically. It's no longer about thinking, it's not about the truth. When we lose our ability to think critically, we no longer want to think critically. Because it's not about thinking at all, it's not about the truth. Think about this. We used to be able to have conversations with people that we disagree with. Whether this is religion or politics or something. When I disagreed with someone, I used to be able to say, look, let's talk about this. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? Now those conversations are becoming more and more difficult to come by because people aren't interested in the truth anymore. All they're interested in is progressing their own view on something. This is why we talk about people having an agenda. People have an agenda, it's because they're not open to some other opposing viewpoint. And as a result, what begins to happen is that I begin to try to control someone. If I'm not open to the truth, if I'm not open to some intermediary thing or something that exists outside of me, I'm only going to seek to try to control you and manipulate you to think how I'm thinking, so that I can do what I want to do. Well, guess what? That's all about me. You see, if I'm trying to control and manipulate someone, I want my will to be done. It's all about me. And most people don't realize, unless you've studied Satanism, that's actually the model of Satanism. The devil is saying, do whatever you want. It's all about you and your will and your desires. Do whatever you want. The phrase is, do whatever thou wilt. That's what Satanism is. Notice how different that is from Christianity. Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Lord, not my will, but your will be done. Notice Our Lady surrenders everything to God and says, be it done unto me according to thy will. Because at the heart of Christianity is a surrender of one's entire life for the sake of love. And Satanism is exactly the opposite. It's all about me, and I'm going to control and manipulate everyone else. You see, when that happens, we lose our ability to see reality. If I'm so focused on myself, I lose my ability to see God and to see the world, and my mind becomes darkened. This is one of the reasons why the church has always understood that those who are holy, those who are open to God and His revelation, are the ones that see reality most clearly. It's not the other way around, because we're able to see as God sees, and God sees everything. What begins to happen when we're no longer interested in reasoned debate, we're no longer interested in conversations to seek the truth, what begins to happen is we begin to resort to forms of manipulation and control. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Shaming, bullying, being shouted down, mob tactics. These things are happening all the time today, and we often hear it in slogans. If you do not say this, then you must be this. If you do not do this, then you are X, Y, and Z. We see this over and over again, an attempt to control and manipulate. But I have good news. God is not interested in controlling us. He's not interested in manipulating us. God is interested in inviting us to see how He sees and to live as He lives. This is the good news of the gospel. So how is it that we can prevent ourselves from thinking in a demonic way? From thinking just merely as human beings think? And how can we really think like God thinks? Well, the key or the clue is in the gospel today. Jesus, immediately after rebuking Peter, says this, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." See, this is the paradox of love. You see, it is precisely those who are humble enough to open their hearts to God and His way of seeing things and willing to live it out through love, they are the ones who are able to see reality. They are the ones who are able to see as God sees. And this is very important for us to recognize, because Jesus Himself, who was perfectly humble, who was perfectly loving, was resisted very, very strongly by the crowd, by a crowd that was thinking in a demonic way. He was resisted and he was ultimately crucified because the crowd was not open to the truth and they weren't open to love. Maybe they mean well. Maybe there are people in our culture that mean well and end up resisting God. Or maybe they don't mean well. Regardless, if we choose to identify ourselves with God, we choose to identify ourselves with justice and love, we shouldn't be surprised that we end up being resisted and maybe even crucified. But the fact is that if we are crucified, if our reputations are destroyed, if we are being harmed, if we're being mocked or being ridiculed, we're being pushed out of our community or out of our family, be of good cheer. Because that means we're willing to lose our life for His sake. And in losing our life for His sake, as Jesus promises in today's gospel, when we die, we will find it in the next.